So next we have Pat Gang, Global Head of Export and Agency Finance for Bank of America, speaking about supply chain finance, recalibrating the stakes. Pat?
Hey, afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me. Very happy to be here in sunny California. Got off the plane from New York last night, and I am always very impressed with the amount of work everybody does out here with palm trees right out your window, so kudos to you on that. I think it's been a really interesting last 12 months, and really, I think everybody from a household name perspective knows physical supply chain issues, right? And they're really very hyper aware of what it's done, from the consumer and Amazon packages not showing up, and really the importance of that, right? So it's really moved front and center, and I think the physical aspect translates to the financial supply chain aspect, right? So that's really more of my realm in terms of if we hit a delay, or if we hit something where a container is not going to be on time, or we've got loading issues. What does that do for the financial supply chain? What does that do in terms of getting your money back in time, and how does that impact the bottom line? So we're really at this interesting conjunction in terms of physical supply chain being top of mind, and hopefully we're starting to get a little bit past some of those supply chain disruptions and a little more back to business as usual. But without a doubt, I think we're hitting the same time where we're also hitting massive macro policy issues around the world. The United States, Europe, Asia, it's really going to be driving pretty much everywhere, right? And we've got inflation that hasn't been seen in 50 years, right? We've got energy prices that are soaring and volatility. And what does that mean in terms of managing that physical supply chain and the financial supply chain? It means there's going to be massive movements, and there's going to be winners and losers, right? Everything that we look at in terms of delays and timing, whenever something isn't there and you're not getting paid, or whenever someone's not paying you, that obviously results in a financial supply chain impact, right? And I think throughout most of the 90s and early 2000s, we've seen limited inflation. We've seen a relatively low interest rate environment, right? Where certainly you've seen rates well above inflation a good chunk of the time, and kind of a 2-3% inflation rate. And I think inflation is important, right? I think the consumer and everyone in this room gets that prices are going up, food prices are going up, energy prices are up. You see it at the pump. It's top of mind, right? So I think whenever we're looking at the impact of that, it's not only impacting our businesses, but of course from a consumer perspective as well, right? So you're looking at what's happening. We had a 9% year-over-year inflation rate, and it went down to 8.5% year-over-year in the month of July yesterday, right? And you saw the equity markets rejoice a bit. Everyone's very happy. We're looking at kind of taming some of that inflation, and we're still running pretty high, right? And food prices are still running pretty high, and a number of items are really, really important in terms of what's that's going to matter for everybody's businesses around the world. And I think when you're looking at a cost of debt and what that means in terms of the variance and kind of that intervention from where working capital is being generated versus inflation, it's really a 6% gap. And even in the 1970s, when we were looking at inflation versus where rates were, and we were tipping at 9-10% inflation, we were already starting with 5 or 6% type cost of debt. In this situation, we're talking at 1 or 2%, right? Where we're ratcheting that up. So I think we've got a long ways to go, and really, I think what that means is there's a lot of opportunity to make more money and really come out a winner in some of these situations in terms of managing your supply chain, right? Because of that, really imbalance in terms of where we're at. So when we're talking about working capital and managing working capital, we're talking about certainly getting your money in sooner if you're collecting receivables, and potentially negotiating contracts and really managing your working capital in terms of paying suppliers later, right? And we've got to balance that. We've got to balance that in today's environment where the resiliency of our suppliers is tremendously important. So, how do we end up at a happy medium where you've negotiated the right price in terms of gross values on invoices or shipping costs or whatever it might be. But you've also negotiated, if you're in a buying situation, negotiated the right payment terms. Because extended payment terms and collecting faster is really magnified. And that's, kind of the first point I really wanted to make is we're in a situation where when we had such tight rates and low inflation, the cost to sit idle was a little less impactful, right? There's still, we're looking back over the last 12 to 18 months and kind of a forward-looking view. We're not exactly sure where this is going to head, right? But I think it teaches us an important lesson in terms of what happened, right? Your value of money is worth 10% less than it was. So money out the door, obviously needs to be tamed a bit in terms of where that comes through. So thinking about when you're negotiating contracts and negotiating those important supply chain resiliency focuses, where that's really going to impact from a financial perspective and impact your working capital, that's going to be able to sustain you through some of those disruptions, is tremendously important. And this is a historical time, right? We're not just talking about, hey, we've got 6 months of data and we expect some things to happen. We're living a real true macro event. And we went through 5 or 7 years of relatively stability, of low rates environment, low inflation. And now this is where, like I said, there's going to be some situations where real money is out there in terms of how you guys are going to manage your supply chain and really impact that. So, I think part of this is planning for the next central bank tightening event, planning for the next credit event, right? All we're doing on the physical supply chain side is certainly building that resiliency, right? We went through COVID, we went through some challenging times there in terms of disruptions, and I think every economist out there is telling you, okay, we're starting to see some of those disruptions come down. We're starting to see the consumer goods, that demand soften a bit, and that might be from the various macro policies that are out there from a tightening perspective, and we'll see where that goes, right? And most people are starting to feel more comfortable. The data is looking positive, but we're just not sure where that next credit event is going to come from. Obviously, the energy, inflationary numbers are due to geopolitical events, right? Where is the next geopolitical event going to come from? And really importantly, where is that next supply chain credit event? And it might not just be simply through government and monetary policy. It's going to come from a lot of different angles. So I think what really the last few years has taught us is we need to have multiple plans in terms of what is plan B and C. And if you have that key exposure to a supplier in APAC, or you have that key exposure that most of your sales are going to a single buyer, and that we're going to see some credit stress on the horizon, what is the plan for really adapting to that, and really kind of creating that resiliency in terms of where we think the next event is going to go through. I work on projects all over around the world. It might be a wind farm or it might be a power plant, and really, we're working with suppliers and buyers. And I think the number one thing we get that is really the download of the last few years. I wish I really had a plan B for this supplier, because now I can't get a supply vessel out to a wind turbine, or I can't get a certain catalyst for a refinery that is really going to delay us, and it's going to delay our investment in terms of CapEx. So really building upon that and being the person in the room that's going to raise their hand and said, well, what happens if we lose this supplier? They're driving a lot of our business. Or what happens if we lose this ship provider, right? It's all got to be in the equation, because I think we've lived real time some major supply chain disruptions. And I think, like I said, from a pure financial perspective, we're in a mode where a rising rate environment, still very historically high inflationary environment, really the highest since post-World War II and the 70s in terms of where that's coming out. So I think what we're going to see is, like I said, there's really an important focus on how do we make more money on that perspective. So we've phrased it as time to play a hand, right? And I think importantly, make a bold decision in terms of where you guys are going to accelerate cash or decelerate cash. And if you're going to accelerate cash, from managing a corporation or thinking about this from an educational perspective, what are you going to do with that cash? And how does that compare for long-term investments, right? And where does the company that you're looking at or working for, where do you guys think this is headed? And taking a view on some, serious volatility that could come in terms of potentially higher rates and lowering of rates, and what that looks like on the long end of a macro curve in terms of the environment, right? So it's going to require some bold decisioning, kind of standing still and sitting on cash is great, but thinking about what that cash is going to be worth, and really having a view that, listen, we think inflation is going to be X, or we think rates are going to be Y, and why do we think we're going to make those adjustments and really manage our business accordingly is going to be important. And obviously planning for potential recession or downturn and credit events that could come, and kind of having that backup in terms of cash and managing your balance sheet is all has to be weighed in terms of the broader environment. So I think with all that on the horizon, certainly kind of working in a broader global trade environment, right? Thinking about what's important for your company, it's always supply chain finance to a large degree really can allow working capital to come in the door and accelerate those accounts receivable that are out there for you. So bring that in and rein that in. But risk mitigation is an important element of this as well, right? So think about where you might want to reduce some exposure, where you think if you have a certain key supplier in a key geography, right? There's a lot of geopolitical issues around the world, and you have to take a view that is that a risk tolerance that I'm comfortable with, and really building upon that and setting up a governance process around that is key. So I think looking at, do I need to take out some sort of insurance? Do I need to take out a fallback? And really, I think importantly, taking on other meetings, thinking about digitization, sustainable finance, all those important elements. There's a lot of really innovative thinkers out there that all they want to do is meet with companies and meet with consultants and really drive that, right? So taking that extra meeting and getting smart, even though you might not be making decisions at a company level for a long time, I think is huge. And without a doubt, that comes with the broader risk mitigation, right? If I have a supplier, and it might be your strongest relationship, but you just have to take a step back and say, what if they are no longer my strongest relationship? And what if there's an issue, whether that is macro rate driven or credit driven or geopolitical driven, what if they fall away? And what am I going to do in that situation? And I think certainly the pandemic has taught us some of those situations that they're still, one of your closest relationships as a company, and some of it might have been out of their control in terms of a Chinese factory shutting down or a certain country no longer being able to produce for a period of time. What does that do, and are you planned for that, right? So I think super important to really build upon that and really look at kind of where the rates are headed, right? In terms of the long-term goal there. So planning for that next credit event, super important. I run a business at Bank of America where we basically build working capital and debt solutions into agency-supported programs. So one thing we always put out there is really the governments are here to help, and we work all over the world in terms of various governments that are supporting working capital solutions. And I think the number one thing we'll say throughout the pandemic, people realize that supply chains are important, and traditionally they've looked at how do we support CapEx, how do we support debt, how do we support exports. I think you've seen more and more that governments around the world, and specifically here in the U.S. as well, they want to support supply chain resiliency, right? So how do we drive that? So know what your company is worth. Know what we're looking at from a hypothetical perspective, that if I needed support, would this be something that I can look at? Obviously, we've seen supply chain programs and that offering go out to suppliers if you're a buyer, and really utilizing that if you're a supplier. But all these programs are really out there in the market. And I think the goal of a lot of these governments is to support certain industries and certain borrowers and certain working capital solution providers during challenging times. So think about what's out there from a broader government perspective, and how does your company leverage that, right? Like, we've got plenty of agri-traders in the United States that are building their business abroad, utilizing government-supported programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've got plenty of U.S. electric vehicle manufacturers, battery manufacturers, lithium miners that have said, okay, to support my investment and to support some working capital, I'm going to speak with the Department of Energy. And I think, certain geographies where you might be selling from the United States, and this all gets flipped, really in most, investment-grade countries, if you're manufacturing there or building there, it all gets flipped in terms of what solutions are out there. So, as a bank, we probably work with 25 different governments around the world for solutions like this for wherever our clients operate, right? So as you're growing, and as you're thinking about working capital, and as you're thinking about how do I mitigate risk, as I start to look at global trade and local trade, know that some of these programs are out there, and certainly think about the politics around it, in terms of what is my current administration, and using the U.S. as an example, what do they want to support, right? The Biden administration clearly wants to support renewable energy. They clearly want to support the electric vehicle sector, and really innovative technology on that front. So there are programs out there, and you're seeing it through the CHIPS Act, you're seeing it through Make More in America initiative, you're seeing it through the Department of Energy in terms of those programs going out there, right? So some of these are just snippets of the last year in terms of massive CapEx investments. And then think about, how do you fit in that supply chain? Are you a supplier on the auto side for some of this EV? How can you get involved in terms of really leveraging that? So, I think really key messaging, right? Working capital is super important. And I think the volatility in rates is going to create a situation where there's, the right spreads in terms of speaking with bank partners and the institutional market, where you might want to go ahead and make some bold decisions in terms of how you're going to manage that working capital. Obviously, think about risk mitigation and how you working capital optimize the balance sheet on that same, but also think about where you fit in terms of the spectrum and how you're going to drive that, and really always think about the impact of the physical supply chain and everything you're doing in terms of managing that and working with all the various consultants and providers and vendors out there in the industry, and what that means in terms of bottom line, what that means in terms of impact based on today's environment. Because certainly the stakes are a bit raised, and I think we're going to be in this environment for a bit longer, and it might swing in the other direction at some point, but it's really about getting ahead of that curve and educating yourself on the market. So that's all I have for today. I am very happy to take any questions from anybody in the room or on the line or whatever it might be, but thanks again to Nick and the team for having me. We're a proud supporter here at Bank of America, and certainly love coming out here to USC to talk to everybody in the room. So thanks a lot for listening in and having me. So.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Stephen Lee. I'm the COO and co-founder at Crowds in the Bay Area. We focus on offering supply chain financing to small and medium businesses throughout the world. The question for you is, with the advent of blockchain and NFTs, do you have anything within your current roadmap structure that allows for supply chain financing to really leverage the current technology that's in play to be able to syndicate, securitize, and sell these receivables on secondary markets?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. And I think pretty much the entire banking market and all competitors will probably agree that everyone wants digitization and everyone wants to see DLT really come to the market. It's really about trying to find that happy medium, I think, in terms of, is this something scalable, from a buyer and supplier perspective and adaptation, and really bringing that forward in terms of where it's going to be most utilized. But I think the kind of paperless initiative and really driving efficiencies is something that every institutional and FI in the market really wants to see. So I think everyone's excited about it. It's probably the #1 topic in most supply chain financing conversations around the world in terms of how do we really leverage this? Because at the end of the day, banks themselves are averse to paper, right? It's the number one thing that probably slows down efficiencies, and we get phone calls in terms of, how can we move this faster? So finding that, right next step and finding the right platform that I think will have the most upkeep is really what everybody's looking for. So I think everyone's really excited about that. We got one more question coming in. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, I'm Yash, and I'll be joining the C10 this year. So I want to ask a very similar question, but what will be the impact of CBDC, digital dollar, that the government is looking into, the upcoming business scenario, and how it will disrupt the banking system and the institutions that are attached to banks?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
I'm asking that what will be the impact of CBDC, that is central bank, so digital dollar that will be issued by government. So how will the ledger of a bank change with it?
Yeah, I think I got the question, but certainly, are we talking about ledgers in terms of yeah, I think without doubt that is a work in progress, right? In terms of where that's going to come through and the distributed ledger associated with that. Once again, it's top of mind. I think everybody in the market is really looking to kind of get that uniformity. I think generally the financial institutional market wants to see a bit more of that. There hasn't been too many grand leaps, but without a doubt, I think guidance from the central banks and the regulators and how that comes through is going to be paramount in terms of adaptation. But it's a good question. So,
thank you.
Thanks.